blind taste test, people prefer new Coke to either old Coke or Pepsi. So they know they've got a winner. So they put this product on the market. Let me see your hands if you remember this. Okay, then you will also remember that no one except members of their immediate families bought any of it. I was telling this story once that there's a Coke distributor in the audience. And he comes up afterwards and he says, "Let me tell you some things." And I said, "I am all ears, lay it on me." And he says, "The week that new Coke came out, the sales of old Coke spiked." This is not good, you know. People are hoarding old Coke for fear they're not going to be able to get it anymore.
I remember doing it.
So I asked him, "How long did it take you to know you were in trouble?" And he said, 2 weeks.
Wow.
2 weeks we knew we were in trouble. And now let me go back to the legend part. The legend says that group of top executives met in that room again, this time without the guy who had led them through the previous exercise. He had gone to work for Enron. They threw that box up there again, and they said, "Okay, let's take another pass at this." And this time they put another word in the box. Instead of the word taste, they put the word tradition. Coke is not a taste, Coke is a tradition. So they then put out a new product, which was actually their old product, which if you bought a Coke product yesterday is probably the one you bought, called Coca-Cola Classic. Is that a great story or what?
That's a great story.
You know, it is really, really important to know what your story is. And if you don't really know what your story is, then you get fouled up in a lot of ways. Okay, that's the reason I love this text, is because there's a debate going on here about the story, and it is exactly the same debate that is going on today in Christianity. Okay, so we're going to start in Mark chapter 8, verse 22, with the weirdest miracle Jesus ever did. Now, you have probably already noticed I am somewhat attracted to odd texts, which is great because the Bible is full of them. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you don't find the Bible an odd book, you have just gotten way too cozy with it, because there's oddities everywhere. Now, I don't think this is Jesus' best miracle. I just think it's his strangest one. You want to vote on best miracle? Raising of Lazarus is best miracle, right? I mean, healing the sick is good, raising the dead is great, but raising when they're rotten, that is truly spectacular. Raising of Lazarus, that's number one. I think replacing that soldier's amputated ear is number two, because that's just cool. Don't you think if you're a Jesus, you'd put on just a little bit crooked so you could remember the event? Sitting there. All right, this one, this is weird. Okay, this is weird. Get a load of this. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't go into the village." Weird. Here's Jesus who can, with a word, raise the dead, make the lame to walk, calm the storm, but it takes him 2 cracks to heal this blind man.
That's some spit.
Really, really strange. And there is a question begging to be answered there. Why does he have to touch him twice? Okay, now, I don't quite have time to do this now, so this is the part you're going to have to take my word for. When Mark tells a story like that, he's almost always got a reason. You know, he's not just kind of slopping stuff down. He's probably got a reason. Some people have compared Mark to Beethoven. I'm a great lover of classical music. I name my dogs after classical composers. I have Prokofiev and Mahler, if you're a fan. And sure enough, Mahler turned out to be neurotic and Prokofiev turned out to be spoiled. I mean, you just got to watch what you're doing. But I don't have a trained ear. And, you know, my idea of kind of doing music criticism of classical music is I know what I like. And I really like Beethoven. I don't care for Mozart. And so one of my friends says, knows I particularly like Beethoven's 7th Symphony. And he says, I want to play the melody line for you of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. So he goes to the piano and he plays it. He says, what do you think? And I said, well, it's not very good. Must be you. He said, no, I played it right. And I said, it's not very good. And he says, no, actually, Beethoven wasn't very good with melodies. You know, if you want a really good melody, you have to go to one of those kind of sentimental Russians, like, you know, Rachmaninoff or somebody like that. He says, in fact, Beethoven wasn't particularly gifted in any area except one. And that was putting it all together. And he says, in that regard, there was never anybody better. The book of Mark's a lot like that. When you look at the individual pieces, they're not very impressive. They don't look very good. But when you put it all together, you kind of get this incredible kind of symphony that plays. And I'm assuming that when Mark tells this story, how he does and where he does, there's a point to it. Okay, that's my assumption. Now, when I come to one of these and I can't figure out why, I always do the same thing. First of all, I ask my freshmen. This is almost never informative, but it's always highly entertaining. So, you know, I've actually been doing this for a few years now. I'll get my freshmen, especially my Bible majors, and I'll say, okay, tell me what you think. Why does he have to touch him twice? And these are the three answers that keep emerging. Number one, temporary power outage. Jesus just doesn't quite have the power of the Lord that day. It's got to kind of hit him twice before we get there. Number two, I really like this one. Jesus is so powerful, he's got to be really careful not to give him too much, or he'll be like Superman seeing through stuff. So you give him to him a little at a time, get him up to 20/20, and then quit. I think that's got possibilities. I like that. Number three, this is my favorite. He couldn't see clearly because he's got spit in his eyes. Kind of an earthy explanation. And so they kind of have this picture of the first time Jesus slaps the spit on, the second time wipes it off, and then there you go. You can see clearly. Well, I'm guessing that none of those are right. All right. And so the second thing I do, when my freshmen let me down, is I keep reading. Now that's actually a fairly good principle of biblical interpretation. When you come up on something you don't understand, if you keep reading, sometimes you'll read something that clears it up. Especially in Mark, where he likes to kind of tell stories over against each other. On the other hand, if you keep reading and it doesn't clear up, you may forget that you had a problem, and that would be some progress. Okay, so I'm going to keep reading. Verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Okay, so Peter got this right or wrong? Right. And we should pause for a moment to celebrate with Peter, because this is the only time in the book of Mark where he is ever right about anything. I mean, in the other Gospels, the apostles are a little slow, but in Mark, they are dumb as shrubs. You just read through Mark and see if that's not true. Now, this is, again, one of those places where if we read Mark carefully, like if you start in chapter 1 and read all the way up to the point where I am in chapter 8, what you will notice is it is basically one long meditation on the power of Jesus. Jesus has power over demons. Jesus has power over disease. Jesus has power over death. Jesus has power over sin. Jesus has power over Sabbath. Jesus has power over the law. Jesus has power over nature. It